After the outbreak of World War II, many countries in Europe quickly fell, as the German army turned its focus to France. The British and French forces, seen as the strongest in Europe, officially entered the war. However, this force suffered consecutive defeats on the battlefield. Over 400,000 troops were surrounded in a small area by the sea, facing the constant threat of complete annihilation. To rescue them, the UK launched Operation Dynamo, the Dunkirk evacuation. The operation was massive, involving all three branches of the military, as well as strong support from the public. In the end, over 300,000 people managed to escape. It was seen as a miracle in military history. However, because this operation was launched at a time of defeat and crisis, many saw it as a retreat of the defeated. So what led to this operation, and how should we view it today? In this video, we will return to the perilous shores of Dunkirk. Let's take a look at how this massive evacuation unfolded. On May 10, 1940, the German army began its westward advance. They attacked France in the Low Countries. This marked the beginning of the Battle of France in World War II. At the start of the battle, the main Allied forces were drawn into Belgium by the German Army Group B. Faced with the powerful German forces, the Netherlands quickly surrendered. The situation in Belgium was also grim, but the main assault came from Army Group A, led by Rundstedt. Army Group A was an armored force. It was made up of 70% of Germany's armored forces. The combat power was formidable. This force forced Luxembourg to surrender without a fight. They advanced from the weakly defended Ardennes forest into France. They first captured the French stronghold of Sedan. Then they crossed the Meuse River. The gates to France were wide open. Less than a week into the war, France had no strategic reserves left, and the Allies lost control of the air. On May 16th, Army Group advanced further west. The attack formed a side-like shape. It cut through the Ardennes forest straight to the French coast. It split the Allied forces in two. To the north were the British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army fighting in Belgium. To the south were the French forces. This sharp side quickly divided France. On May 20th, Guderian's troops captured the French coastal city of Abbeville. The division of France was complete. The next step was to annihilate the remaining Allied forces. German armored forces advanced north along the coast. They planned to capture three port cities along the coast: Calais, Boulogne, and Dunkirk. To prevent the Allies from escaping by sea, the French commanders did not realize the severity of the situation. Whether it was Gamelin or his successor Weygand, their tactics were still stuck in World War I thinking. They repeatedly called for a breakthrough in the German Army Group A's blockade. They wanted to link up with the French main forces to the south. They hoped for trench warfare along the Somme River. To achieve this, French forces launched several attacks against Army Group A, but it was all in vain. The British also sent tank battalions to counterattack the Germans near Arras. They launched a fierce counterattack against the Germans around Arras, but they failed to make any significant breakthroughs. At this point, the Allies were desperately fighting off Army Group B in Belgium, while the noose of Army Group A's encirclement grew tighter. The situation was dire. The Allied forces were in danger of being completely wiped out. The UK realized that breaking out southward was no longer feasible. They began planning for an evacuation by sea. On May 22nd, the UK sent two infantry brigades to secure the ports of Boulogne and Calais, but Guderian soon captured them. The only remaining evacuation point for the Allies was Dunkirk. By May 24th, Guderian's armored forces were just 10 miles from Dunkirk. Once Dunkirk was captured by the Germans, the Allied forces fighting in northern France would lose all escape routes. However, at the moment when the fate of hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers was in jeopardy, Germany suddenly changed its military strategy. On the afternoon of May 24th, Hitler suddenly issued a command to halt the advance. The reasons behind this decision have been widely debated. In summary, there are three main factors. The first was to protect the armored units. The Army Group had already removed most of the German armored forces, making them precious. The tank units had endured heavy losses during their long advance. They needed repairs, and Dunkirk's Flanders area was filled with rivers and swamps. It was not suitable for mechanized movement. If the armored units suffered major losses here, Germany would not be able to carry out further operations smoothly. This concern wasn't without merit. Just 3 days earlier, the British had launched a counterattack against the Germans in the Arras region. Though small in scale, it still made some breakthroughs. The British used the new Matilda heavy infantry tanks. These tanks were heavily armored. For a while, Germany's anti-tank weapons struggled to damage them, especially causing problems for Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. Although the air's counterattack was just a small raid, many German commanders, including Army Group Commander von Rundstedt, mistakenly believed this was a sign of a larger counteroffensive by the British and French. They overestimated the strength of the enemy. At this point, the German advance was already very rapid. The armored units had gone far ahead. Their supply lines were stretched, and Rundstedt, being a very cautious commander, didn't want to risk having the armored units advance so deeply without support, fearing a counterattack from the British and French. Therefore, Rundstedt suggested to Hitler to pause the attack and wait for the infantry and armored units to catch up. The second reason was overconfidence in the German Air Force. The head of the Luftwaffe, Göring, was Hitler's favorite and highly regarded. Seeing the army making headlines in the French campaign, he wanted to find an opportunity to showcase the strength of the Luftwaffe, to prove the decisive role of the Air Force in the war. This was also to solidify his position within the military. He actively pushed Hitler to adopt the plan for the Air Force to act independently. Göring assured Hitler that the Air Force alone could handle the situation. With intense airstrikes, the Luftwaffe could completely block Dunkirk and destroy the British and French forces at the beach. This promise made Hitler overly confident in the Air Force's capabilities. Göring's arrogance and Rundstedt's caution now aligned. Together, they pushed Hitler to issue the order to halt the advance. The third reason was Hitler's political and diplomatic considerations. The Battle of Dunkirk was a crucial part of the French campaign, and at this time, Hitler was not acting purely from a military perspective. He had some political and diplomatic concerns as well. Hitler had always harbored some sympathy for Britain. As a nationalist, he believed that Britain and Germany were both Germanic nations. There was no direct conflict of interest between them. He valued Britain's global influence. He hoped that after Britain's submission, it could be useful in the new order led by the Third Reich. Hitler feared that if the British Expeditionary Force was completely wiped out, the humiliation and anger would push Britain to fight back fiercely. Therefore, Hitler tried to signal Germany's unwillingness to drive Britain to the brink by allowing the British forces to retreat. This was meant to encourage Britain to consider peace talks. These three reasons were the main factors behind Hitler's order to halt. However, Hitler and many German commanders did not foresee that this order would create a crucial window for the Allies to retreat. In fact, by this time, the Allied forces were exhausted, their morale was low, and they were on the verge of collapse. The halt of the German advance gave the enemy a valuable opportunity to catch their breath. The remaining Allied forces regrouped at Dunkirk. They took advantage of the coastal defense line and the cover of the British Air Force. They began organizing a large-scale maritime evacuation. Historians consider this decision to be one of Hitler's major strategic mistakes on the Western Front. At 1857 on May 26th, the Dunkirk evacuation officially began, codenamed Operation Dynamo. From the start, the evacuation was very difficult. After 2 days of stagnation, the German ground forces resumed their attack. The Allies were facing a pincer attack from the German and the Army groups, and due to German artillery blocking the area, along with the need to avoid reefs and mines, the British had to take the longest route for evacuation, greatly increasing the risk of exposure. This meant that the evacuating soldiers were more vulnerable to German air attacks. The Dunkirk port was narrow and crowded. Even in normal conditions, it required cooperation between pilots and captains to safely enter. After the evacuation began, the wreckage from German air raids on ships piled up. It became very difficult for ships to dock, and the German Air Force had almost destroyed all available boarding facilities at the port. Only one eastern breakwater, after adding a wooden dock, could still be used. The British used collected timber to create boarding ramps and push trucks into the sea to form makeshift bridges. The remaining soldiers had to board from the beach. The soldiers in the front lines were half submerged in the water. Sometimes they were soaked through and still did not make it onto a ship in time. Due to limited rescue resources, the Allied soldiers had to leave behind all heavy weapons and equipment, boarding the ships alone. The name Dunkirk comes from Dutch. It means church on the dunes. In the following days, the British and French would pray for divine salvation here. At first, non-combatants and soldiers without officers in charge boarded. The evacuation site was quite chaotic. The officers in charge of maintaining order used foil wrappers from cigarettes and chocolate to cut out the letters S and O, an abbreviation for senior naval officers. This allowed them to show their authority as order keepers. Naval officers and armed sailors also joined the efforts to maintain order. The combat troops boarding later were generally disciplined. especially those boarding at the eastern jetty. They lined up in an orderly fashion according to their units. Disorder was rare, however. The evacuation site was far from calm or safe. On the first day of the evacuation alone, the German Air Force launched 12 airstrikes. A total of 300 bombers and 550 escort fighters took part. They not only destroyed port facilities but also carried out heavy bombing of troop transport ships, particularly the Stuka dive bombers, which dived to low altitudes before releasing their high explosive bombs. Their accuracy was very high. The Royal Air Force provided escort for the ships crossing the channel. On the first day, the Royal Air Force sent 287 sorties in 22 waves. They shot down 38 enemy planes at the cost of losing 14 aircraft. The RAF fighters sent to France lost 60% of their aircraft in a single day. But throughout the evacuation, the pilots continued to fight the German aircraft in the skies despite the dangers. Many of the battles took place above the clouds, defending against German planes approaching, so the real air battles were even more intense than what the soldiers on the beach witnessed. During the evacuation, the Royal Air Force carried out over 2,700 sorties to provide cover. They lost 106 aircraft. In coordination with ground fire, they shot down around 140 German aircraft, strongly supporting the Allied evacuation. Prime Minister Winston Churchill later praised the Royal Air Force's performance, saying, "I salute these young pilots." Apart from the RAF, the soft sands of Dunkirk also served as a protector for the soldiers. The bombs dropped by the Germans would first bury themselves in the sand before exploding. The impact and debris were absorbed by the sand. Sometimes after the bombing ended, the soldiers who had been lying down stood up, finding that most of their comrades were unharmed. Of course, those boarding at the port and rocky beaches weren't so lucky. On the first day of the evacuation, Britain sent a cruiser, 8 destroyers, and 26 other ships to join the operation. This was the greatest effort the British government could muster at the time. As early as May 20th, Churchill had already prepared in advance. He ordered the gathering of ships. However, the plan at that time was not to evacuate the entire expeditionary force. Instead, it was to evacuate any small units that might fail to break through southward. These ships were intended to bring them back to Britain. But now the workload had increased tenfold from the original plan. The British government immediately requisitioned all available boats, including small ones without sea crossing capabilities. Naval warships could not get close to the beach due to shallow waters, but small boats could ferry soldiers from the shore. These small boats were responsible for transporting soldiers to the warships for their return journey. However, this evacuation speed was still not satisfactory. On May 27th, only 7,669 soldiers were evacuated. At this rate, it would take nearly 2 months to evacuate everyone. So the British began calling on the public to help. Soon, people from Britain and France and Belgium responded to the call. They came to Dunkirk in their own boats. These boats included lifeboats, tugboats, speedboats, fishing boats, barges, flatboats, and yachts. These small boats shuttled between the shore and the larger ships. They ignored German airstrikes completely. They made trip after trip, ferrying Allied soldiers to the larger ships. Some even rescued soldiers who had fallen into the water. Churchill called these small boats the little ships of Dunkirk. It was a testament to the unity of the Allied people. Through the joint efforts of the military and civilians, the efficiency of the rescue operation was greatly improved. By May 28th, 17,800 soldiers had been evacuated, and the weather conditions were favorable for the operation. During the Dunkirk evacuation, the weather was overcast, especially the thick clouds and dense fog. This somewhat hindered the accuracy of the German airstrikes. It made it difficult for the Luftwaffe to effectively target ships in port facilities. The bad weather forced the Luftwaffe to reduce the number of sorties. This gave the Allies more opportunities for evacuation. Thousands of soldiers were evacuated to Britain every hour. On May 29th, 47,310 soldiers were evacuated. On May 30th, 53,823 were evacuated, and on May 31st, the number reached its peak. 68,014 soldiers were evacuated by June 1st. The Luftwaffe gradually learned the RAV's patrol patterns. As soon as British aircraft returned to base for refueling, German bombers would seize the opportunity to launch airstrikes. On that day, the Germans sank or destroyed 40 ships. This was almost equal to the total number of ships lost in the previous days, despite the heavy losses due to Luftwaffe attacks. On June 1st, 64,429 soldiers were still evacuated from Dunkirk. To reduce losses to the ground forces and air force, the evacuation was moved to nighttime starting June 2nd. Once night fell, all ships would sail towards Dunkirk simultaneously. From evening until early morning, soldiers were transported non-stop. In the next 3 days, over 26,000 soldiers were evacuated to Britain each day. By 2 p.m. on June 4, 1940, the German ground forces fully occupied the Dunkirk beach, aside from over 40,000 French soldiers who had been holding the perimeter and were captured. The rest of the Allied forces were evacuated to Britain. The 9-day Dunkirk evacuation was complete. Operation Dynamo was officially completed. In the entire Dunkirk evacuation, 338,226 people were saved. Of these, around 215,000 were British, around 90,000 were French, around 33,000 were Belgian soldiers. During the evacuation, 861 boats of various sizes participated in the rescue. Nearly a third of the boats were sunk. Over 40,000 Allied soldiers were captured. Over 28,000 soldiers were killed. Artillery, trucks, tanks, and other heavy equipment were all abandoned. Though the Dunkirk evacuation was organized under battlefield defeat, it was a miracle in terms of scale, difficulty, and execution. It was truly a miracle. It had both practical and spiritual significance. Some military analysts even believe that Germany's defeat in Europe's liberation began here. From a practical standpoint, countless heavy weapons were abandoned on the beaches, severely weakening the Allies. At the time, there seemed to be little hope for victory. But what made this operation so valuable was that it preserved many experienced officers and soldiers for the Allies. For Britain, the abandoned weapons and equipment were regrettable, but they later overcame the shortage of weapons through various means. But if their manpower had been destroyed, it would have been irrecoverable in the short term by any means. Hitler's delay in landing in Britain was largely due to hundreds of thousands of British soldiers holding the home front. This formidable defense showed the strength of their will. It was precisely because the core of the army was preserved that for years later, during the D-Day landings, the Allies, having been evacuated from the sea, would counterattack from the sea. In addition, during the cover operation for this retreat, the Royal Air Force's excellent performance gave the British public hope. It was proven that the RAV's aircraft, models, and pilot skills were on par with Germany's. This gave Britain confidence in defending against foreign invasion over their skies. In the upcoming Battle of Britain, the RAF would severely strike and restrain the German Luftwaffe, making an indelible contribution to the victory on the European front of World War II. Spiritually, this operation proved to the world that the British resolve to resist was not a powerless cry in desperation, but a firm action carried out. Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave his famous speech, "We shall fight on the beaches." He acknowledged the efforts of the British military and civilians. He assessed the future situation. He inspired the British people to unite as one, to fight for the ultimate victory. This won the support of the people for the difficult struggles ahead. During the dark times as all of Europe fell under Nazi rule, the evacuation of Allied forces became a beacon of hope for escaping the darkness. Everyone knew that on the other side of the English Channel, there was a resilient force always ready to counterattack. This operation also created the Dunkirk spirit of mutual aid in adversity, and the spirit of Dunkirk facing challenges together. During the darkest hours of the anti-fascist struggle, it inspired the courage of the British and other Allied peoples to continue the fight. As Churchill said, "War is not won by evacuation. Do not consider this rescue a symbol of victory, but within this rescue lay the seeds of victory."